for everyone joining us. Thank you everyone for joining us for this presentation. The topic is what is the MCAT and how to prepare for it as a community college student. So let me just start off with quick introductions. So yes, my name is Ken. I'm the director of MCAT for MedicalSchoolCoach. In terms of my academic background, I went to UC Berkeley, graduated with degrees in bioengineering and molecular cell biology. I then went to Harvard University where I completed my PhD in neuroscience. So that was a lot of school and education, but I will say for many years, I've also been helping students with the MCAT exam. It's actually been just over 11 years now. And for the first 5 years, I was with the Princeton Review. I was a senior MCAT instructor, premier tutor, content developer, and instructor trainer, which means that I used to fly all across the country training new people to become MCAT instructors for the Princeton Review. So because of that, it really goes beyond just knowledge of the MCAT, but really what is the best way to teach students? What is the best way to guide students to score well in the exam? And just over 6 years ago, while I was in Boston, I was recruited by the CEO and founder of MedicalSchoolCoach to start our own MCAT division. So that's how you get to 11 years of experience. So I'm really happy to be here and share my knowledge and expertise with all of you. All right, here's the plan for today. We are going to discuss what is the MCAT, what is a good MCAT score, how to prepare for the MCAT as a community college student, and also planning on having some time near the end to answer any questions that you have. At the same time, you're also welcome to throw in any questions you have in the chat. I will try to address them as they come, but if the questions go too quickly, I might have to address them later in the presentation. Okay, so the MCAT exam, just to go over the format of the exam, you should know that there are 4 sections, right? Pretty standard for a standardized test to have a lot of different sections. So the 4 sections of MCAT, they're usually called the Chem Phys, CARS, Bio-Chem, and Psych-Soc sections. Each of them actually have much longer names. So if you look at the Chem Phys section, it's really the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, which based on that name, you probably figured out this is why we usually prefer the abbreviation Chem Phys. This is the first science section, and it's 95 minutes long. The second section is the CARS section, or the critical analysis and reasoning skill section. A lot of students think of this section as being similar to the verbal reasoning section of the SAT or the reading section of the ACT. And it's true to some degree in that, yes, there's no science content tested in this section, but it's not a great comparison. And that's simply because the high school exams focus more on reading comprehension, as in if you read and understood the passage, you're probably going to be able to get the questions right. The CARS section is more difficult because while there are some questions testing reading comprehension, the majority of the questions test your critical analysis and reasoning skills. And what that really refers to is your ability to identify passage arguments, right, and assess the strength of those passage arguments. And that's just a little bit more difficult than the high school exams. So the third section is the Bio-Chem section, also called the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems. And the last section is the Psych-Soc section, which is also the psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. You can see here that with the 3 science sections, they're each 95 minutes long, and the CARS section is 90 minutes long. That means if you're just taking into account testing time, you're looking at 6 hours and 15 minutes of test taking time. This isn't even including the breaks, right? You do have breaks between the sections. You even have a 30-minute lunch break in the middle of the exam, but what you should expect on test day is a 7.5-hour test day experience, right? This is actually the first point that I want to make with the MCAT, which is this is a really long exam, right? This is pretty much the longest exam that most students will ever take on their career to becoming a physician, right? At most academic institutions, your final exam might be 3 hours long, maybe 4 hours long, but 7.5 hours, that's quite a lot, right? So one of the challenges of a long exam is it's difficult for students to maintain their focus throughout the entire duration of the exam. If you try taking a practice exam, you might realize after the Chem Phys section, you're already pretty tired. You're pretty exhausted, and it's hard to maintain focus for the cars section. And it gets even worse from there with the biochem and psych-soc sections. Another challenge is because this exam is so long, it can be difficult to pace yourself, right? Making sure that you're not spending too much time on the first few questions and running out of time later, right? So pacing and stamina, these are two areas that you will want to focus on if you want to perform well in the MCAT exam. And one of the best ways to do that is to take multiple full-length MCAT practice exams, right? So most students, I'd say, at a minimum, they're taking 6 full-length practice exams, and many students will take more, maybe 10 or 15 practice exams. All right, next, let's talk about the scoring system. Each of the 4 sections receives a score between 118 to 132. And I know this is kind of a funny scale, right? Why is it 118 to 132? Well, it's essentially a 15-point scale, right? So a 118 is essentially a 1, that's the lowest score. And a 132 is a 15, that's the highest score. Right in the middle, 125, that's the average, which would be an 8 on a 15-point scale. This was actually designed intentionally by the AAMC, and that's because if you have a student who gets an average score in all 4 sections of the exam, then they'll get a 500. That makes it very easy for medical schools to determine if a student's MCAT score is above average because their score is in the 500s, or their score is below average because their scores is in the 400s. And this is probably not a surprise, but the MCAT also follows a normal distribution or a bell curve, which means most students are going to be scoring close to average, and there's very few students who are going to be scoring very low, and similarly, very few students who are going to be scoring very high on the MCAT. Next, in terms of the format of the exam, it is a multiple choice test. And some students actually find that kind of relieving because many of the classes you take as a pre-med, physics, organic chemistry, and such, they're usually not multiple choice exams, right? They're free response tests, where for physics, you have to throw out free body diagrams, write out the equations, show your calculations step by step. And for organic chemistry, you're drawing out the structures of molecules, you're drawing arrow pushing diagrams. That is not required on the MCAT. But at the same time, it's not just a benefit, it's also it can be a potential downside because you might recall from your chemistry and physics classes, because it's a free response exam, even if you don't arrive at the correct answer, you can still get partial credit, right? With MCAT, it's a multiple choice test. It's all or none, right? So you either get the question right or you get it wrong. And just a couple of other points, just if you want to compare this with other standardized exam, every question is worth the same amount of points. So there's no question that's worth more or fewer points. In addition, there's no guessing penalty. That means when you're taking the MCAT, you should never leave a single question unanswered. The next point is actually a particularly important point, and that is on the MCAT, there is a combination of both freestanding questions and passage-based questions. The passage-based questions are extremely important, and it's actually the reason why the MCAT is the most difficult of all the pre-health exams, right? So you've got the MCAT for medical schools, you've got the PCAT for pharmacy schools, which has actually been retired, right? You've got the DAT for dental schools, you've got the OET for optometry school, you've got the PACAT for physician assistant schools, and so forth. The main point, as I was saying, is that the MCAT is more difficult than all of those other pre-health exams. The reason why is because all of the other pre-health exams are simply freestanding questions when it comes to the science sections. And freestanding questions are exactly what they sound like. They're standalone questions that simply ask you, do you know this scientific fact, right? So if you know the scientific fact, you're going to be able to get the question correct. So in that sense, most of the pre-health exams are focused on memorization. Do you know the science content or not? The MCAT does have a few freestanding questions. About a quarter of the exam is freestanding questions, but that means 75% of the MCAT are passage-based questions. And the way these passage-based questions work is they're going to present you a passage of text. This text is going to introduce new information and new situations that you've never learned about before. And what you're expected to do is apply your knowledge of the basic science to the passage information to answer those questions correctly. So the MCAT, instead of being a test of rote memorization, is really a test of application. Are you able to apply your knowledge of the science content to a new scenario, right? And that can be challenging for a lot of students. There's a lot of students who have excellent GPAs. They've got 4.0 GPAs, but they can't even break 500 on the MCAT. And that's just because they've only been taught how to memorize, right? They haven't been taught how to apply their knowledge. And I'll talk more strategies about how you can approach this later on, but this is an important point that I want to mention, that the MCAT is primarily passage-based with the questions. Finally, let's talk about test dates. The MCAT is offered throughout the year from the months of January through September, with the exception of February. That means the MCAT is offered in January, March, April, May, June, July, August, September. It is not offered in February, October, November, or December. That's important to keep in mind because at some point when you're thinking about taking the MCAT, you need to plan when you want to take the MCAT, right? So for example, you can't say, oh, I want to study for the MCAT over the summer and take it in November because there's no November MCAT test date, right? So what I'll say is for most students, they'll fall into one of the following categories. Students who study during the fall semester and cram over winter break, you take the MCAT in January. Students who study during the spring semester to take it in April or May, or students who use their summer to focus on the MCAT and they take the exam in August or September, right? I would say most students fall within one of those three categories in terms of when they take the exam. Now, for each month the exam is offered, there are multiple test dates. There's usually 68 test dates available each month. So you have a pretty good number of options. However, something I'm going to emphasize is to make sure that you register for the exam early, right? And let me just describe for you a little bit about how MCAT registration worked in the past, right? So if you're not aware, the MCAT is administered about 100,000 times a year, right? Now, it's not 100,000 test takers because there's students who retake the exam, but the exam is administered about 100,000 times a year. And in the past, there would be one big day where MCAT registration would occur. And typically what would happen is MCAT registration would open and the website would crash, right? So no one could register for the exam, even though that was when you were supposed to register for the exam. And it was a really frustrating process for students because since registration is really competitive, if you don't register on the first day, you likely won't be able to get the test date and testing center that you want, right? So the AMC has made a few adjustments to how MCAT registration works now. Number one, MCAT registration, which there's two phases, right? So if you want to take the MCAT in the spring, registration occurs in October. If you want to take the MCAT in the summer, registration occurs in February, right? So first, they split registration over 2 days, right? So first day is primarily for students on the East Coast. Second day is for students on the West Coast. And that sounds like a decent solution, but honestly, a lot of students registering for the exam can cause the website to crash. A lot of students divided by 2 is still a lot of students, right? So there's often still a lot of technical glitches when it comes to the MCAT and registration. So what they currently have is a queue system where when registration opens, and they'll tell you what day and what time it opens, if you jump on the website and you're on the website, let's say, 15 to 30 minutes before registration opens, when you click to register, you might see yourself, maybe your position 300 or 400 in the queue. Okay, no problem. You wait maybe 15 to 20 minutes, you're able to register. What happens if you don't jump on early? Well, if you don't jump on early, maybe you're an hour or two late, you might find yourself as position 4,000 or 5,000 in the queue. And then you have to sit there for maybe 3 to 4 hours for all the other students to register before you. And if you wait later in the day, maybe it's in the evening, you enter the queue might not be so long, but what you see is that there's no test dates available within a 100-mile radius of where you are, and you have to, fly to Arizona to take the MCAT, right? So the main point I'm trying to make here is MCAT registration is a bit of a competitive process. You want to make sure you know when MCAT registration opens, so that way you can be online at least 30 minutes before registration opens, so you can get your desired test date and testing center. Okay, so that hopefully gives all of you a general understanding of what the MCAT exam is, its format, and such. The next thing I want to talk about with the MCAT is, what is a good MCAT score? I mentioned earlier that the MCAT follows a normal distribution, and you'll often hear these different numbers and scores, right? Someone might say, oh, you should aim for at least a 512 MCAT score. And other people might use percentiles. They might say, oh, you want to aim for an 80th percentile score, right? Both is honestly fine. And ultimately, you have to come back and see, what is an 80th percentile score, right? And just to give everyone some background in case you're not familiar with percentiles and such, right? Percentiles just means how many other students did you score better on the MCAT, right? So for example, if you have a 50th percentile MCAT score, that means you have a score that is higher than 50% of all test takers. If you have an 80th percentile MCAT score, that means you got an MCAT score that is higher than 80% of all test takers. So that's why, of course, you always want a higher percentile score. And in terms of what is a good MCAT score, it's not just your MCAT. You also have to look at your GPA, right? So this is data that the AMC provides each year on what percentage of applicants with different GPA and MCAT combinations are accepted to medical school. So let's look at an example. Let's say you're an applicant, you've got a GPA of 3.5, and you scored a 507 on the MCAT. All right, well, 305, that's 3.5, that's between 3.4 to 3.59. And a 507 MCAT, that's between 506 to 509. You can see, looking at this table, that 33.6% of applicants with that MCAT and GPA range were accepted to medical school, which is decent, but can, of course, be better, right? And it's not a surprise that if you look at the table, the higher your MCAT, the higher your GPA, the higher the percentages you're looking at. So if you're at the top, if you've got a GPA greater than 3.79, if you've got an MCAT greater than 517, 84.2% of those students were accepted to medical school. And it's honestly pretty decent, right? 84.2%, but you'll also notice that's not 100%. And the main point there is your GPA and MCAT are important, but they're also not everything, right? If you haven't heard it already, at some point, if you speak to any medical school admissions office and you ask them how they select their applicants, the term you're going to hear repeatedly is they perform a holistic review, right? They're going to review your entire application, which includes your MCAT and GPA, but also your personal statement, your letters of recommendations, and all of your experiences, your clinical, volunteer, research, and leadership experience. All of that is part of your medical school application. But it's still very much true that numbers are important, right? And I say this because occasionally, you might go to a conference and you speak with a representative from a medical school, and you're concerned. You're like, hey, this is my GPA, this is my MCAT. Do I have a shot at getting accepted to your school? Someone will be honest and say, hey, yeah, you're within the range of our accepted students, or they'll tell you you're actually a bit below. You might want to retake the MCAT to get a higher score. But sometimes there's schools that will say, we have no minimum, right? They'll say we review all applicants, and that to some degree is not fully true. I think it's a little unfortunate, when they say that information, and that's because all of the data from medical schools is available. If you look at the MSAR, the medical school admissions requirements, you can look at the school and see that the 10th to 90th percentile MCAT and GPA of students is within this range, right? So if you see the school, their 10th percentile GPA is a 3.5. That means less than 10% of the students they accept have a GPA less than 3.5. So if you have a 2.5 GPA and they say, oh, we'll still consider you, that to some degree is not the best information, right? So usually it's best to look at the actual numbers, look at the actual statistics, right? 10th to 90th percentiles of the MSAR to see where you fit in with those numbers. And numbers, they're often used by medical schools these days to filter applicants. And it's kind of an unfortunate reality that there's some medical schools that receive over 10,000 applications, right? And if they have over 10,000 applications, they can't review all of them. So if they're going to filter out applicants they don't want to consider, or they don't have time to consider, you can't filter by, activities descriptions, letters of recommendations, personal statements. The only thing you can really filter by is MCAT and GPA. All right. So with that in mind, with your MCAT and GPA, what you really want to do is make sure your score is high enough so you don't get filtered out, right? And once your scores are high enough, then they're going to review the rest of your application. All right. And I do see a question, which is, does the MCAT score determine which state you get accepted? How much is the chance to get accepted in California? So the MCAT does not determine which state you get accepted, right? So when you apply to medical schools, you select each school that you want to apply to, right? So if you want to apply to one school, you can apply to one school. If you want to apply to 50 schools, you can apply to 50 schools. But every school that you apply to will consider you independently of other schools, right? So if you want to get accepted to California, a California medical school, you of course need to apply to the California medical schools. But do note that California medical schools are among the most competitive in the nation. This is why a lot of students in California will apply out of state, so that way they have more opportunities to get accepted to medical school. All right, now with this data, a question that I often get is, if I have a high MCAT score, can I get away with a lower GPA? Or vice versa, if I have a lower GPA, can I make up for that with a high MCAT score, right? We can consider both of these scenarios looking at the information in this table. So let's say you did really, really well in your college courses. You've got a 4.0 GPA, but the MCAT was kind of tough, so you scored below average, right? So we said average is around 500, so if you're below average, maybe you're 494 to 497, you can see here, even if your GPA is above 3.79, if you have a below average MCAT of 494 to 497, your odds aren't great, right? So if you have a high GPA, you got a low MCAT, honestly, you should just retake the MCAT exam, right? And here is where on this table, you can see how much of a difference it makes to improve your MCAT score by just a few points, right? 11% chance higher, 11% chance higher, 15%, 14%, right? Improving your MCAT score by a few points has a really, really, really big impact on your chances of getting accepted to medical school. Now, let's consider the opposite scenario. Let's say you are a student who struggled a little bit with your college classes, right? Maybe you didn't quite figure out how to study, or you had other obligations that prevented you from doing your best, right? And you've now sort of figured things out, but the end result is your GPA is still kind of low, right? So a below average GPA for someone applying to medical school, but let's go with a 3.1, right? So 3.1 GPA is on the low side for students who are going to be applying to medical school. So if you've got a 3.1 GPA and you crush the MCAT, You get a score greater than 517, you're looking at 52.6%, which honestly is pretty darn good, which really is the point that if your GPA is a bit low and you're feeling kind of bad about that, it doesn't mean you have to give up your chances of getting accepted to medical school. If you can perform extraordinarily well in the MCAT, you're in a great situation, right? So the MCAT can make a huge difference to students, regardless of if you've got a high GPA, an okay GPA, or a below average GPA. Okay. So hopefully when you're looking at these numbers, it's giving you a better sense of what kind of numbers you might want to be aiming for the MCAT. And I see here another question in the chat. Is there an acceptable amount of how many times you can repeat the MCAT? I'll give you two numbers. So the first set of numbers are the limits set by the AMC. You are allowed to take the MCAT 3 times in 1 year, 4 times in a 2-year span, and 7 times in your lifespan, right? That's the limit as to the number of times you can take the MCAT. And no, I do not recommend taking the MCAT 3 times in 1 year or taking it 7 times, right? Something you have to realize for the MCAT is the more times you take the MCAT, the worse it looks on your medical school application, right? It's not like the high school exams where you can pick and choose which scores you're going to send to colleges and universities. When you take the MCAT, medical schools will see each of your scores. And the more scores you have on your MCAT, the worse it's going to look on your application. And part of the reason why is if they see a student who had to take the MCAT 4 times to get an acceptable score, why is that a concern for medical schools? Well, one thing I'm going to tell you is the MCAT has nothing to do with your ability to succeed as a physician, right? It has no correlation to how good of a physician you're going to be. So what does the MCAT correlate with? Well, it correlates extremely well with your medical board exam scores, which means if you score well in the MCAT, you're probably also going to score well in your board exams in medical school. So to some degree, that means the MCAT really could just be a measure of how good of a test taker you are, right? But that does matter to a lot of medical schools because they want to accept students who are going to be able to pass the board exams and graduate and become physicians. So when they see a student who has taken the MCAT 4 times, they begin to wonder, hey, is this a student that also has to take the MCAT? Sorry, is this a student who's going to have to take the board exams 4 times to pass? Right? Or is this a student who's not going to be able to pass the board exam? So the main point is you do not want to take the MCAT a whole bunch of times. That's going to make it more difficult for you to get into medical school. Keep in mind, the MCAT's not cheap. It costs, I think, $335 to take the MCAT once. And if you take into account the different resources you might purchase, like MCAT books, question banks, MCAT prep courses, MCAT tutoring, it can be a very substantial investment of your time and money. So students should never take the MCAT until they are prepared. You don't want to take the MCAT just to see what the exam is like. You don't want to take the MCAT just to see what score you can get. You want to take the MCAT when you are ready to take the MCAT. And that's not to say that you can't retake the exam, right? Half of all MCAT test takers will retake the MCAT. So it's very common for students to retake the exam, but you should really only be retaking the exam because you have a good reason to, right? Which could be, hey, this first time you took the MCAT, you didn't prepare as much as you would like, right? So you got a score, it was a little bit lower than you want a higher score, right? Or on test day, you got testing anxiety, you underperformed, so you need to retake the exam to get a score that's a better reflection of your academic abilities. But the main point is, with the MCAT, the fewer times, the better, right? The best MCAT score is 1 score. You take it once, you get a good score, you don't have to take it again. All right, I hope that was clear with regard to your question. The next topic that I'm going to discuss is, as a community college student, how might you want to prepare for the MCAT? And I get this question a few times in presentations, and my response is always the same, right? Which is, if you're in high school, if you're a first or second year community college student, honestly, you should just focus on your classes, right? Most students won't take the MCAT until their junior year, their senior year, or until after they've graduated, right? The MCAT is not something you take in your freshman year or your sophomore year. The earliest a student might take the MCAT is the summer after their sophomore year. And this is for really, really intense students, right? Like students who manage to take all of the prerequisite courses, which I'm talking about all of these courses, right? So a student took all of these courses by the end of their sophomore year, they can take the MCAT that summer. That's fine, but keep in mind most students will wait until taking the MCAT. So here are all the courses you should take for the MCAT, right? 2 semesters of general chemistry with lab, 2 semesters of organic chemistry with lab, 2 semesters of physics with lab, biochemistry, 2 semesters of general biology with lab, and intro psych, intro sociology. It's in your interest to take as many of these classes as you can before you take the MCAT. And the reason why is because these classes you're going to take over multiple years. You're not going to be able to retain all of the information in your brain, right? You're certainly going to forget some of the information, but if you did really well in your classes, all you have to do is review the material that you previously learned. If you haven't taken a class, that means you have to learn the material from scratch for the MCAT, right? So taking the classes is much easier than not taking the classes. And same thing, if you get an A in a class, that's great because that means you probably learned the material properly. So later on, you just have to review the material. But if you get a C in a class, maybe you didn't learn the material so well, and that means when you're studying for the MCAT, you have to relearn the material properly, right? So when you take these classes, realize that taking these classes and doing well in these classes will help you later on with your MCAT preparation. And I can see a question here, which is, does it make a difference whether you take calculus-based physics or really non-calculus-based physics, right? Which this is often separated in different ways, right? It's often, physics for engineers and physicists, for scientists and engineers, or physics for life science majors, right? I will say there's no right answer here. There's pros and cons of both. If you take calculus-based physics, the nice thing is you're going to learn physics better than someone who takes non-calculus-based physics, right? It's just the reality that calculus-based physics is more rigorous. Because of that, you're probably going to find physics on the MCAT to be on the easy side. The downside, of course, is calculus-based physics is more difficult than physics for life sciences majors. So, one can help you with MCAT, but could be harder for you to maintain a high GPA. So that's why I said there's no right or wrong answer, right? You either do what might be better for your GPA, worse for your MCAT, or what's a little bit more difficult for your GPA, but better for your MCAT. Okay. And another question here, is there a specific type of biology class we have to take? So at most schools, it's general biology, right? Pretty much all academic institutions should have general biology as a class. And if you're a biology major, biochemistry major, you'll have to take the general biology. I will say, though, that if you take 1 year of general biology, you will cover almost all of the material tested on the MCAT, but just realize that the level of detail that you get in 1 year of general biology is often not adequate for a good score on the exam. This is why for a lot of students, if you're able to take additional upper division or advanced biology courses, that can definitely help you with the MCAT, right? So physiology, for example, genetics, cell biology, neurobiology, uh, endocrinology, right? These advanced biology courses can help you score better in the biology section beyond just taking general biology. But at a minimum, you need to take general biology. Should these classes be taken at community college or university? So, I mean, I think if you're at community college and you're transferring to university, if you want to finish the university in 2 years, right, a 2+2 transfer, I think you're going to have to take some of these classes at community college, right? It's tough for you to, take everything else and try to graduate from a 4-year institution in 2 years that way. So most students are going to take a combination of these classes at community colleges and at a 4-year institution. All right. Now, these are the courses that you want to take. If you have more questions, please feel free to ask. But I also want to talk a little bit about coursework planning, because here you see there's a lot of courses that you need to take for MCAT, but it's not the same thing as planning out your coursework, right? The first thing I want to talk about is additional majors and minors. For some reason, there's a lot of students who really like to say, oh, I am a biology, physics, and statistics triple major with a minor in chemistry, right? Thinking, oh, if I do all these things, it's going to stand out. Well, the reality is it doesn't, right? Medical schools don't care what your major is. They don't care if you're a biology major or a bioengineering major, or an English major or a music major, right? So don't take on additional majors and minors just because you want to stand out, because it simply means you're going to have to take more classes. And when you take on more classes, that reduces your chances of maintaining a high GPA, right? And on that note, it can be helpful for you to plan out your coursework years in advance, right? So you don't necessarily just want to go at this semester by semester, because remember what I said earlier, you've got all these classes that you want to take before you take the MCAT. Let's say you're a student who wants to take the MCAT in your junior year, so you can apply the summer after your junior year. That way you can go directly into medical school without any taking any gap years. Well, you need to plan your courses accordingly, because just consider the chemistry series. Normally you have to take Gen Chem 1 before Gen Chem 2, before OChem 1, before OChem 2, before biochemistry. That's 5 semesters worth of chemistry. And if you miss any of those semesters, that can make it tough, because then you're probably not going to be able to take all of those classes by your junior year, and you might have to wait until your senior year to take the MCAT. And another thing that's important there in terms of planning out your course schedule is this last point, which is you don't want to pack too many difficult courses together, right? The general recommendation for students is 2 hard science courses per semester, right? So you might say, all right, next fall, I'm going to take Physics 1 and Orgo 1, right? There's your 2 science courses. You really want to avoid a semester where you're taking 3 hard science courses, right? So if you're taking calculus, general chemistry, and physics in one semester, it's probably not going to be a very fun semester. And it's going to be really hard for you to maintain a higher GPA, right? So 2 hard science courses and have the rest be easier courses to help, maintain a high GPA. That's the general recommendation. And I see a couple questions here. So one question is, can someone go to med school with a nursing bachelor? Yeah, absolutely. All right. So you can get a bachelor's of nursing. You can go to medical school. You can even work for a few years as a nurse and decide then you want to go into medical school. The only thing that's important is in your application, you need to be able to explain why medicine, right? Because, you're clearly already in healthcare as a nurse, right? So what specifically is the reason why you want to be a physician as opposed to a nurse, right? But you absolutely can go from nursing into medicine. Other question, if we finish a majority of these classes during our years at community college and only have a couple more to take, would it look better to take the rest of the classes in university, or can we take them in community college after we graduate from university? Again, I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer. What I will say though, and keep in mind to some degree, I'm generalizing here because at this point I've taught over 1,000 students with the MCAT, right? From, you know, community college students who transferred to students who have always been at four-year institutions to post-bac students to non-traditional applicants, right? So I am generalizing here, but something that I do notice is sometimes the rigor of community college courses may not be the same as the rigor at four-year institutions. And you see that in two ways. Number one, many students at community college with 4.0 GPAs, they transfer to a four-year institution and now they have a 3.5 GPA in their fall, right? So it's very common that once students transfer to a four-year institution, they find that maybe the material is more difficult, the exams are more difficult, or there's more competition from your classmates that with the curve, it's harder to maintain a high GPA, right? At the same time, when you're in a more difficult environment, if you get an A in those classes, it probably means you learn the material better, right? So I go back to there's no right answer. If you take more of your classes at community college, you'll probably have a higher GPA, but realize that you may not understand the science content as well as someone who took all the classes at a four-year institution, which means you probably have to do some more work for your MCAT prep. Other question, if I must have one semester where taking multiple harder classes inevitable, would it still be possible? I mean, if you're at this point where you don't have a choice, that probably means you didn't plan particularly well early on, right? Because there's not that many classes, right? If you look at this list, right, in terms of hard science courses, there's 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's really only 9 hard science classes that you have to take, right? There's other classes you have to take for your major, but it's really 9. So if you planned well, you shouldn't have to take more than 2 in any semester. But if you are in a situation where you have to take 3 or more, just plan accordingly, right? Maybe that's the semester you have to step back with your extracurriculars so you have more time to focus on your classes. Make sure to go to office hours more often. Make sure to, always keep up and stay ahead of your schedule with your studies. And I say that because I mean I did that a bunch of times, right? And many of the things I say, I'm sort of a hypocrite because I was a simultaneous major and I took 3 or 4 hard science courses, but I will tell you it's not fun. The other point I want to make here that's quite important is research different classes and professors, right? And I mean this, it's a little unfortunate, but sometimes as a pre-med, you have to learn how the system works. And sometimes the way the system works is there are better professors and there are worse professors, all right? I went to UC Berkeley. It was a great school. I really enjoyed it, but most of the, UCs are not teaching universities. They're research universities, right? The professors there are there to do research, not to teach the students. So in many cases, you should be grateful for some of the professors you have at community college because they probably care about teaching more than many professors at four-year institutions. And as an example, I had a professor in biology who's probably going to win the Nobel Prize in the next 5 to 10 years for the contributions they made in research. But the lectures was literally them pulling up PowerPoint slides and just reading the PowerPoint slides to us, right? And of course, if someone's just going to read the PowerPoint slides, word for word off the slides, you can just do that yourself and they're not really teaching you anything, right? But that doesn't apply to all professors at these research institutions. Some professors are better, some professors are worse. My recommendation is speak to the upperclassmen at your school. They might tell you, oh, for biochemistry, take it in the fall with Professor X, right? Don't take it in the spring with Professor Y because Professor X is a better professor. Their exams are more reasonable, or, more students get a higher grade in that class, right? That's something that's really important just to make sure you plan well, right? It's unfortunately not the reality that all professors are the same, all professors have the same grade distribution, and all professors will provide the same learning experience. So definitely speak to upperclassmen for their tips and recommendations on which classes you should take with which professors. And the sooner you figure out that information, the sooner you can plan accordingly with your schedule. All right. I see another question here, which is, does taking the classes in university versus community college look better to med schools? Well, it is something that med schools are going to take note of, right? Which is, there's a lot of schools where most of the students graduate with a 3.8 to 4.0 GPA, right? Medical schools have received applicants from, probably every institution across the country, and they've received many of them. They're probably familiar with the school that most of the students have a high GPA from that institution. So because of that, that's why you also have the MCAT exam. If you have a really high GPA from community college, you've got a 4.0 GPA, but you take the MCAT, you get a 495, that's where they might be more concerned about your academic abilities, because your 4.0 GPA, is it really because you are a good student, you know how to study, and you've got the academic potential to perform well in medical school? Or is it just that your community college classes were easy and it was really easy for you to get a bunch of A's, right? So again, there's no right or wrong answer, but you just want to make sure that your application, it makes sense, right? So if you get a 4.0 GPA in community college and you get a 515 on the MCAT, nobody's going to ask any questions. Nobody's going to have any concerns about, does it look better that you took these classes at community college or at a four-year institution, if things make sense. It's only when, things look a little bit odd that they'll start to wonder. So I hope that's clear. All right, and I do want to finish off the rest of the slides and hopefully answer a few more questions. But once you get to the point of studying for the MCAT, you do want to make sure you create an effective study plan, right? Now, I'm going to be really blunt here, which is if you want to score well in the MCAT, you need two things. You need to know the science content, and you need to know how to apply the science content. And the way you achieve the two is reviewing the science content and by doing practice questions and practice exams, right? Many students will make an error where they spend too much time doing one and not the other, right? So sometimes you hear about students who they pick up a set of MCAT books from a test prep company. They're just going through the books, taking very detailed notes. They're very meticulous with their content review. But now it's a month before their test day and they realize, oh, I should probably start doing some practice questions. But at that point, they haven't done enough practice, so they don't get the score they want. And what often happens is these students will then tell other students of, oh, I wasted too much time on content review. You should just start by doing practice. So there's these other students who don't do any content review. They're just doing thousands and thousands of practice questions and just getting a bunch of questions wrong. And they also don't get a good MCAT score, right? So I'm going to be very, very honest here that for the vast majority of pre-med students, a perfectly good distribution is a 50-50 split. Plan on spending half of your time studying for the MCAT, reviewing the science content, and the other half of your time doing practice questions. A 50-50 split is perfectly fine for the vast majority of pre-medical students. Now, my recommendation too is don't just start studying, put together a study plan. So this is a spreadsheet that we often use to help build study plans for students. So that way they know what they need to do for each day of their studies, from the day they begin working with us until testing. In addition, with the science content, you should plan on reviewing the science content over and over again, right? Many of you have probably seen this before, right? If you've had to memorize the amino acids for your biochemistry class, you realize if you spend a weekend memorizing the amino acids, by the next week, you've forgotten half of them, right? Most science concepts, you're probably going to review 10 to 12 times before you take the MCAT, and that's something you should expect. You cannot expect to read your MCAT books once and retain all of that information. You're going to forget the information, so you have to constantly review the information over and over again. And here on the slide, there's actually a couple of free resources here I'd recommend all of you to check out. The first is the MCAT Basics podcast. So if any of you like podcasts, I'll put the link in the chat. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, right? It's the MCAT Basics podcast where Sam Smith, who was a pre-med student who came to work for MedicalSchoolCoach in his gap year, he created a podcast on all of the high yield information on the exam. Again, it's completely free. A lot of students like to listen to it because it's a really convenient way if they're commuting to work, if they're working out at the gym, if they're doing chores, just to passively review the science content information in podcast format. Another great resource for you to review the science information is our YouTube channel. So if you go to this YouTube channel, you can actually see a lot of videos of me teaching the science content. So you can certainly check these out as resources or bookmark them because they will certainly be helpful for your MCAT preparation later on. Now, as for practice, the point that I'm going to make here is practice exams. There's so many students who take a lot of practice exams for the MCAT and they keep getting the same score over and over again, right? They get a 497, a 498, a 497, a 499, a 498, and they feel stuck, right? And they're often asking me, hey, why isn't my score improving? Well, the answer is simple. If you're getting the same score over and over and over again on practice exams, the reality is that you're not learning from your mistakes, right? Because if you were learning from your mistakes, you shouldn't be making the same mistake over and over again, and your score should be improving. So if you want to review practice exams properly, here are 3 questions you need to ask yourself, which is, why did I get this question wrong? How do I get this question right next time? And if I missed the question because I was lacking knowledge of science content, what was that content knowledge I was lacking, right? You really need to be honest with yourself and ask yourself these 3 questions, because if you don't perform this kind of assessment, you're just going to make the same mistake over and over again, right? So don't be the students where you miss the question and you're like, oh, let me read the solution. Okay, now I understand. Because clearly, if you keep getting the same practice exam scores, you really don't understand. But if you reflect by using these 3 questions, this is what's going to allow you to improve your MCAT score. And with that, I want to leave one final tip I almost forgot. So I added the slide in the end because, of course, artificial intelligence is a thing now, right? There's ChatGPT, there's Gemini, there's a lot of AI out there. If you're not using AI to study for the MCAT, as well as your college courses, you're not studying properly, right? AI is a fantastic tool. Yes, schools are trying to figure out, how to prevent students from taking advantage of AI in bad ways, but AI is a fantastic tool, and all of you should be using it to study for the MCAT and study for your college courses. It is so easy these days just to go on ChatGPT and say, hey, I don't understand SN1 reactions. Please explain this to me. Or, you can even take pictures and be like, hey, on this organic chemistry exam, I don't understand this reaction. You upload an image, it'll explain it to you, right? So all of you really should be using AI to study for your college courses. And the MCAT, it is an incredible tool. So now, with that, I conclude my presentation. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Or if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is down below, k@medschoolcoach.com. And next Friday, I think it's close by. I can't say I know the geography of Southern California particularly well, but next week I am going to Mount Sac Antonio College, where I'll be giving an in-person presentation on the MCAT. So you're stopping by, you can certainly say hi. And yes, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. That the information was helpful.
All right. So participants, if you do have any questions, feel free to even unmute yourself and ask the question. It looks like, we do have a few more minutes, okay? But if not, then in a minute or two, I will close out the session. I also did include the link to this PowerPoint presentation. Also, if you check out UC Davis's Health Professions Advising Office, they have some excellent videos overall for pre-med support, as well as information on basically studying for the MCAT. So there's a lot of really good and free resources available for you. So please, check those out. Does it look like there are, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just said great.
For this session, I'll be honest with you, I learned a lot, okay? So even for me, who has a basic understanding of the MCATs and some of the details, but I never really knew kind of the inner workings of the MCAT and also the different pieces and components. I've always been taught, yes, definitely do well in your science courses, keep really good notes, because all the content from the MCAT is basically the classes that you're already taking. So make sure that you do well on those classes. But Dr. Kentao today really broke down the information really well. And also I really love seeing the chart where it has GPA as well as MCAT scores. Can I ask you, is that overall GPA or that specifically, or is that more so the GPA for like the math science and the prerequisites for med school?
So that is for overall GPA, and I should have also noted that was specifically for allopathic or MD medical schools. So the numbers are slightly different for students interested in osteopathic or DO medical schools.
Okay, great. With that,
I do see a few questions. Maybe I can tackle them real quick. So one of them is our community college has biology series in 3 courses. Are all 3 used in place of Bio 1 and 2? So it might depend on your institution, because if your institution is on a quarter system, then 3 quarters is essentially 2 semesters. And usually the best way is just to ask your peers, right? Because your peers will be able to tell you if those are the courses you should take as a pre-med, right? Because what I'll say is, if you have 3 courses in your biology series and it's 3 semesters and the 3rd semester is on plant biology, I would just skip plant biology because that's not tested on the MCAT. How do medical schools take a student only taking 1 difficult course at a time? If you're only taking 1 difficult course at a time, that will probably take you much more than 4 years to graduate. So I would say at least 2 courses at a time is likely preferred. If you're only taking 1 course at a time, and it takes you many, many years, I think there will be some concerns of, can you handle the rigor of a full medical school course load, right? So with that in mind, if you can perform well in the MCAT, that might be able to reduce some of their concerns. But I would say 1 course at a time is probably a little not quite adequate. You probably want to take at least 2 at a time. And when it comes to undergraduate degrees, do medical schools care whether or not you receive some type of honors? I mean, honors are always nice. It's a nice, feather in your cap, right? So, if that means doing a senior thesis in research, I think that's perfectly fine. So nothing wrong with honors and scholarships, right? Those can only help. They certainly won't hurt you. And I find myself reviewing practice exams from exams rather slowly. How do I review practice exams properly so that I may more efficiently study for MCAT? I find that reviewing my old practice exams can take over 3 days. So what I'll say is 3 days is actually quite reasonable, right, for reviewing a practice exam. And it really depends on your performance, right? So for a lot of students, if they take their first practice exam, if they're below 500, it means that you've missed quite a lot of questions. And if you missed quite a lot of questions, that means you have quite a lot of questions to review and make sure you fully understand how to answer properly. So I wouldn't be worried about it taking you 3 days. 3 days is quite reasonable. But what you want to make sure is you are learning from your mistakes. So in your next few practice exams, you start to miss fewer questions. And as you miss fewer questions, it actually reduces your study burden, right? Because if you go from missing 50 questions to 25 questions, the review will go faster. So that's the nice thing about studying properly for the MCAT, that as you study better for the MCAT, you start to miss fewer questions, and that reduces your study burden. So as you get closer to test day, you're actually studying less, not more.
Hey, it looks like it's 12:33, and we do have to close out the session. But again, thank you so much, Dr. Ken Tao, for providing both our community college students and our counselors such wonderful information. I learned a lot today, on the MCAT and also the details, and actually it's going to help me also better counsel students when they maybe not have the most stellar grades. Okay, so how to focus basically on the MCAT and doing well on that, or even repeating some of those courses if necessary, or having a really good study plan so that they can have the best MCAT score as possible to increase their chances of getting to medical school. Thank you.